Oh, sure. Well, I'm a son of Washington State. Grew up in Eastern Washington. Was pleased to go to Washington State University to study economics and math. And then after doing a year of volunteer work in Africa, I went to the other Washington State of the East, that some people call Harvard. So I went to Harvard for my master's and studied and taught economics at Harvard while I was there. And then worked in economic development internationally for the government in Dubai, and then with our U.S. State Department in Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, we're in a very left-wing state politically, and I think there is some genuine concern out there in trying to lift up our working class folks. But I also think here in this state, there's some politicians kind of running to get progressive trophies that we're seeing. Washington State already has nearly the highest minimum wage in the country with an inflator. So we already have very liberal minimum wage policy. We also have border communities, particularly in Spokane, where we have a federal minimum wage just across the borders. We have some real competition concerns, and in Spokane, we have a real threat of losing business out of state. I think most concerning are what these wage impacts might do to two groups. One is disadvantaged groups from ethnic groups that have lower participation in the workforce, and then what it might do to our young people who need to enter the workforce. Both of these groups would be most susceptible, I think, to the negative impacts of an increase in minimum wage, and they're both groups that we need to increase. I've actually sponsored legislation that would reduce the minimum wage in our state for a specific group, and that would be teenagers working summer jobs. I think and I hear this frequently from my constituents, we have a generation of young people that are not getting that first job to learn the American work ethic, and because the cost of hiring them has grown so high. I've actually had business owners tell me that they used to love to hire teens during the summer, not because it really added to their overall productivity, but because they thought it was the right thing to do. Yeah, it certainly does. I mean, Washington State really has two economies. You have the Metro Seattle economy, which is booming with Amazon and the high-tech field, and then you have the rest of the state. And, in these two Washingtons, we have to be careful that progressive policies in downtown Seattle aren't the same policies that we see in places like Pasco or in Ferry County or in Spokane County, where people do have different economies. In my district, I do have both rural, urban, and a border. So we see all those in the 6 districts in Spokane. So I think we're well placed to be a voice of caution on these matters. There's a lot of discussion about whether wage rates should be set just at the city level, which we're seeing some complications from, or whether they be set here in Olympia. I think maybe they ought to be looked at the county level to some extent, because, and again, that's wage and labor rates, because you want an elected official over a bigger geography dealing with things. When we have different wage rates in Washington State, it makes it very challenging for businesses. You think about the different wage rate in SeaTac versus in Seattle. Well, how does a business that serves both those areas from outside of those areas, how do they keep track of those things? Think about the costs of payroll, and then let alone the cost of enforcement. Often these things are passed at the municipal level when they have been with really no thought to how you will enforce. Well, then you got to hire more people for the enforcement mechanism. Well, then you're raising property taxes to pay for those people to enforce, and how does it become a funding mechanism? So at the city level, it's just really it's not a great place to make these variances in wage and labor rates. Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think that there's not enough small business owners who speak out. Usually small business owners are busy, running their businesses and trying to chase that American dream and taking risks and creating the wealth and prosperity. A lot of elected officials in Olympia forget where wealth and prosperity comes from. If you don't have that entrepreneur, particularly that small business entrepreneur, taking that risk and serving need, then none of this stuff funds. Have money for education, have money for anything else. So I think part of it, some folks here, especially Seattle, Seattle area legislators just don't know. The other thing is a lot of them are chasing kind of progressive, very liberal goals of their very liberal base, and it's a popular thing to do and a thing to talk about. But from some of those groups, we also have some very active labor organizations involved in this debate that, frankly, are using minimum wage legislation as sort of a vehicle to promote unionization. I think you've seen that in the CTAC and have the CTAC initiative, where it's run with a headline about increasing the minimum wage, but then when you look at the fine print, it's actually kind of a pro-unionization measure. Well, there's a big piece of the debate now, which is some union-backed groups have announced they're going to put an initiative on the ballot that would increase the minimum wage to $13.50. That's been pulled pretty extensively, and I think that they've picked the upper bound of what they can think they could pass if there's not a strong opposition to that effort. We'll see whether they collect the signatures. I expect they will, and so if they were to do so, it'd either put it in front of the elected officials here, or put it directly to voters. So to some extent, we're looking at a series of tough options here in Washington State when it comes to things. Again, I'd remind everybody, we used to have the highest minimum wage in the country. I think we're still nearly in the top 5. So it's not like Washington State is not chased liberal and progressive policy on this, and so it really is, I think, time for caution and time for small business owners to speak up on these issues and make sure people know and their neighbors know. Well, I have a lot of concern about further increasing one of the already highest minimum wages in the country, because I think it will drive businesses out of our state. I think it will hurt small business that already face tough regulations with things like Labor and Industry, Department of Ecology, Department of Revenue, how those things are collected. And I think it will hurt demographic groups, our underrepresented minorities and teenagers. So I really think it is time for caution, but it's also time for people to speak up and fight back on these issues, because if people just sit on the sidelines and don't participate in this minimum wage discussion, there were very liberal politicians in Seattle that will ram this down the throats of the state of Washington, and I think we'll all suffer a result.